So this talk is about a very specific act of translation or comparison. It's the translation into French of the American constitutions, state and federal, by a white colonist from Saint-Domingue, former Haiti, named Charles Carré in 1791. And I want to use this very interesting text to talk about translation as an act of comparison in two senses: the comparison of one language into another, of course, that's sort of the everyday sense of translation that we have, but also the translation of one society's practices into those of another. And my basic point is that translation is an act of comparison in both of these senses, and the translation at issue here demonstrates very clearly how comparison and translation are kind of wrapped up one inside the other. Now, this text by Carré had a very pointed thesis, and it was that the United States, after 1787, when the federal constitution was adopted, and Saint-Domingue in 1791, when France was in the process of adopting its own constitution, were compatible societies. He thought that they were similar enough to allow the American model to serve as a model for Saint-Domingue, and that's why he decided to publish his translation of the American constitutions. He made this comparison at a time when the horizon of expectation in Saint-Domingue, for white colonists at least, was beginning to be unsettled. So in 1791, they're sort of 1 year into a rebellion of the free people of color of Saint-Domingue, but it was still stable enough. The racial and the legal order in Saint-Domingue was still seen as at least stable enough to plan on an indefinite continuation of the plantation slave economy. And so he envisioned the American constitutions as a model for this future, which he could still sort of project forward, even though we now know in retrospect that that model had a very limited lifespan remaining in Saint-Domingue. But the fact that he could envision this future tells us something very important that American historians are increasingly insisting upon, and that is the pro-slavery character of the American constitutions and of the 1787 federal constitution in particular. And if you follow sort of American historical and political debate, you know that this kind of this consensus has sort of reached has been articulated in a journalistic form in the recent 1619 project in the United States, which has been somewhat controversial. Maybe I'll touch upon that at the end of my remarks. But I think that is only one way to see this translation. And that is because translation is also always an act of comparing practices and not just texts. And practices are not stable. They were particularly unstable in Saint-Domingue in 1791, however much this author may have had his own sort of vision of the future of the colony. In 1791, as I mentioned, Saint-Domingue is already looking back on a rebellion of free people of color that had begun in October 1790. That would initiate the sequence of events that we know now as the Haitian Revolution. And nor, for that matter, were racial practices in the United States stable at this time, either in the north or the south of the United States. There was a loosening in some directions, a hardening in other directions, and that made for a dynamic rather than a static picture in the society that Carré sought to translate into French Caribbean terms in 1791. Now, this effort at translation involved a problem that could not be evaded. I have a little text that I want to invoke here, which gets at the phenomenon of translation in a particularly interesting way. This is an American writer named Lydia Davis. She's also a translator, as it happens, and she observes that in translation you are writing, yes, but you are not only writing, you are also solving or trying to solve a problem not of your own creation. The problem can't be evaded as it can in your own writing, and it may haunt you later. This is a recent essay just published a few years ago, I believe. And the problem that Carré has to solve in this translation of the American constitutions is that of race and slavery, otherwise known as the problem of equality, otherwise known as the problem of freedom. How Carré tried to deal with this problem at a textual level is the issue I take up in the first part of my paper. How he dealt with it in his own life story is the subject of the second part. And that, I think, is where we see all too clearly that the problem he tried to solve at a textual level would come back to haunt him later at a personal, biographical level. Okay, so that's the overall argument, and I want to begin with sort of his vision of the American Constitution. I call it a political vision of the Constitution. I think I use that term because he had a sort of very didactic approach to the American Constitutions. They were there to serve a particular purpose, to teach a particular lesson, and it's one that he announced in a prospectus that he published, I think, just shortly before the actual text came out. This is the text itself, the actual translation, and then just before that came out, he published, also in 1791, a kind of prospectus, and it begins with a characteristically late 18th century call for regeneration by constitution framing. So this is kind of the zeitgeist of the late 1780s, and he says here on this very first page, the moment approaches when the colony of Saint-Domingue will undertake the great work of its regeneration, and when its residents must think seriously about crafting its constitution. And in this process of regeneration, the key element for Carré was to translate the texts that in his and other French colonial accounts had enabled the triumph of the American Revolution over Britain. And in this, he's following in the footsteps of a whole series of other French colonial figures, like the Creole lawyer René Hilliard d'Aubertoy, whose text you see right here, Historical and Political Essays on the Anglo-Americans, which was a kind of narrative of the American Revolution that included a translation of, most notably, the 1776 Declaration of Independence. And this is one of the very first texts that I looked at when I started thinking about this translation, because I wanted to see how he rendered this French Creole sort of radical lawyer, not himself a slave owner, but very much a defender of the Creole legal order, how he rendered the famous words that Jefferson had drafted for the Declaration of Independence, subsequently edited by the Continental Congress. And it turns out, well, as translations go, this gets an A, as the grade that we would give. Ce sont des vérités évidentes que tous les hommes ont été créés égaux, qu'ils ont reçu du Créateur des droits inaliénables, tels que la vie, la liberté, et la recherche du bonheur. Okay, as translations go, pretty good. In other words, not too interesting. You don't begin yet to see the sort of interpolations that my character, Charles Carré, is going to engage in when he gets to the state and the federal constitutions. So Carré is following in this tradition of drawing on, trying to render the American legal constitutional corpus into French, and he writes a sort of long preliminary discourse in which he tries to explain this political didactic vision of the Constitution. He says that we suffer from ministerial despotism here in the French colonies. He says that the Americans have arrived at a kind of federative pact between the national and state government that's worthy of imitation, although he also warns that it may one day come undone. So there's a kind of premonition of the Civil War there from a white French Caribbean voice. He talks about how the Constitution promotes liberty, by which he means the protection of private property. Some measure of social mobility is promoted by the American constitutional order, particularly for poor whites. And I think he himself, my reading of this passage is that he himself is from a kind of petit blanc, a poor white background in Saint-Domingue. He says that aristocracy is contrary to liberty. And then finally, he defends autonomy for Saint-Domingue within the French constitutional order. So, of course, Saint-Domingue is still a part of the French Empire at this time. France is drafting what will become its very first constitution in 1791, and he's sort of playing with what could be the future of Saint-Domingue within this constitutional order. And I mean, he's a little mischievous about it, because at the very end of his text, he publishes the 1774 address of the Continental Congress to the French Canadian inhabitants of Quebec, which is where the Continental Congress encouraged the Quebecois to join the cause of American resistance to Great Britain. And that message, in 1791, is a distinctly ambiguous one. Nonetheless, he's not, at least explicitly, he's not explicitly calling for independence here. It's something more along the lines of autonomy within a French imperial orbit. Okay, so that's basically his political vision of the French Constitution. Then he goes on to translate the texts themselves. He's not the only lawyer to be translating these constitutions into foreign languages. This is happening in the United States itself on the eve of ratification. So in states like Pennsylvania, which has a long-standing German population going back to the German-speaking population going back to the 17th century, in places like New York, which has a Dutch-speaking population also going back to the 17th century, there were translations of the American Constitution into Dutch and German in order to prepare the sort of political battle over ratification. And now Carré comes along 2 years after that, and this is 1791, as the Constitution is being implemented with his own translation. The key problem that he has to solve does not come from the Southern slaveholding constitutions. Those are relatively unproblematic for him because they already include the terminology that he needs to render this text into French. And so just to give you two examples, the South Carolina 1790 Constitution has a voting rights provision that he renders in French. Nul ne pourra être élu membre de la Chambre des représentants à moins d'être blanc libre. So you can't be elected a member of the House of Representatives unless you are a free white person, at least 21 years old. That's what it says in English, and he renders it accurately into French. The Georgia 1777 Constitution has a similar provision. That's the original on the top, and his French translation is on the bottom. All white male inhabitants, at least 21 years old, shall be allowed to vote, and he renders that accurately. Tous les habitants blancs âgés de 21 ans have the right to vote. Okay, so on and so forth. Virginia, Maryland, etc. He kind of passes over those relatively quickly and unproblematically. The problem for him, of course, is the northern states. That's where he has to begin to do some especially creative translation work. And in some cases, it's so creative that he simply ignores things and doesn't include them at all. So, for example, the Vermont 1777 Constitution, he completely omits from the document altogether. Even though he's claiming to produce a translation of all 13 state constitutions, this one, including this initial provision from Chapter 1, Section 1, which was the basis for the abolition of slavery in Vermont by constitutional proclamation, just doesn't appear in the text at all. That all men are born equally free and independent and have certain natural, inherent, and inalienable rights. That's gone in its entirety. He includes Massachusetts, but he omits the very first article of the Massachusetts Constitution, this one right here. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. That provision was used to pursue the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts by a judicial decree in the early 1780s in the Quock Walker cases. That's just poof, gone. Not there in the document at all. And then you get to the New Hampshire 1783 Constitution. And this, for some reason, he decides that this is the one that he wants to treat as somehow representative of the American constitutions. And he goes through and gives you pretty much all of the salient provisions for kind of my purposes of figuring out, what are the racial practices that are being translated here. So here's Article 1. The original is on the top. All men are born equally free and independent. In French translation, this becomes tout gouvernement tire son origine du peuple est fondé sur son consentement et n'est institué que pour le bien général. So the first sentence is gone. Yeah, so this is why you have to read these texts pretty carefully. There's a lot of stuff is happening here. Article 2, natural rights. All men have certain natural, essential, and inherent rights, among which are life, liberty, etc., becomes tous les hommes blancs libres. And you know what's happening. What he's adding there is, of course, the word blanc. Tous les hommes blancs libres de cet état. And he's basically taking the Southern constitutional text and transposing it onto the Northern Constitution here, the 1783 New Hampshire Constitution. And he has to do this because in all of these states by 1791, slavery had been abolished, whether by judicial decree or by the constitutional text. And then we get to Pennsylvania in 1794, which has this provision, Article 9, that the general, great, and essential principles of liberty and free government include that all men are born equally free and independent. Give me a guess. Does that appear or doesn't appear in the translation? No, correct. You got it? Okay. All right. I think I can begin to skip along here. You're getting the picture. Section 2, the voting rights provision. Representatives shall be chosen annually by the citizens of the city of Philadelphia, becomes les représentants sont choisis par les citoyens blancs libres de la cité de Philadelphie. And said there's another voting rights provision. He does the exact same thing. There's also a provision about the right to bear arms. That becomes a right to bear arms if you're a free white man of this republic. Okay. And in all of these respects, he's doing something very interesting. He's actually anticipating the future of Pennsylvania constitutional history because, some 40 years later in 1838, Pennsylvania will modify its own constitution so as to limit the suffrage, the right to vote, to free white people only. All right. Now, I observed earlier, citing Davis, that these interpretive choices or practices would come back to haunt Charles Carré. And now I want to kind of show you how by telling you a little bit about the story behind this very interesting text. So the story of the person who did this translation. His family came from Normandy in France. It looks like the first Carré ancestor may have come to Saint-Domingue as early as 1717. So they may have settled in the colony as of that early, but they maintained a property in Normandy, a fief that they leased for decades, indeed throughout the 18th century, and that was kind of passed down through the generations. Charles Carré and his brother, who's named Jean Thomas, may have come to Saint-Domingue sometime after the 7 Years' War, so maybe in the 1760s or 1770s. We're not exactly sure when. But one of them, the brother, eventually gets into the sugar plantation business. He acquires a plantation or inherits a plantation, perhaps from his family, that's located in the north of Haiti, near Cap Français, at a place called Borne, and you can see that. I don't know if this has a red squiggly thing or not, but it's right up here in the north. These documents, by the way, are part of a genealogical file that his descendant, 20th century American descendant who left his papers at Swarthmore College, did all this genealogical research and tracked down the history and revealed this, among other aspects of his background. So the brothers are in Saint-Domingue at the time of the revolution, and then they leave the colony in 1792, 1793. And guess where they go? They go to Philadelphia, among no other place. They are exiled there probably sometime it's after the beginning of the slave revolt in 1791 and before the emancipation of slavery before the initial abolition of slavery in Saint Domingue in 1793. They go to Philadelphia. They're brought there by a famous American painter named Charles Wilson Peale, who's sympathetic to the French and sponsors a lot of these refugees in Philadelphia. There was a yellow fever outbreak in the city at the time, and sort of these French Caribbean refugees, speaking of climate, are seen as the only people who have immunity to yellow fever. In fact, they're blamed for bringing the yellow fever to Philadelphia. So he's there in 1793. By the way, this is an account that his brother wrote of their sort of narrow escape from almost being killed in Saint-Domingue in 1792 or 93. It's a very interesting and kind of characteristically white melodramatic account of the slave revolt of 1791 to 3. In any case, Charles, eventually becomes kind of a teacher. He makes his way to Baltimore. He starts publishing documents about English grammar and sort of puts himself out there as someone who can teach French and English to the local French exile population. He becomes an American citizen in 1795, and then in 1799, he tries to go back to Saint-Domingue with his brother to reclaim their property. And then is exiled one more time in 1801 from the colony, by which time Saint-Domingue, of course, has its own constitution, the 1801 Constitution of Toussaint Louverture, which had abolished slavery, and it probably explains why the brothers were exiled a second time. They come back to Philadelphia. They start up a school for French Catholic refugees called the Claremont Academy, just outside of Philadelphia. And at some point in the early 1820s, Charles makes his way to the south, to Natchez, Mississippi, and dies there that year. A few years later, his niece will try to claim from the French government part of the indemnity that the French government offered, that the French government negotiated or coerced from the government of Haiti in 1825 to compensate for the quote-unquote loss of plantation property during the Haitian Revolution. That's the story. That's the story behind the text. And what I think is interesting about this family narrative of trying to hold on to the future of racialized slavery is that it's echoed in the United States. And in many ways, it is intensified there by the impact of the Haitian Revolution, including on a legal and constitutional level, and not just in the South, but also in the mid-Atlantic states like Pennsylvania, which reverts, as I was pointing out, reverts to Carré's understanding of the Pennsylvania Constitution in 1838. I think all of this shows that in many ways the American constitutional order, state and federal, was indeed pro-slavery. It was a translation that, to borrow a phrase from Emmanuel Levinas, reveals the discordances of the American constitutional text. And here I'm borrowing from a really interesting essay by Levinas on the translation of the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew into Greek for the Jewish population of, I think, 4th or 5th century Egypt. And he says here that translation reveals the discordances of the text that will one day be interrogated by philosophy, midrash, etc. He sort of plays with this paradox that, on the one hand, under Talmudic law, you're prohibited from translating the Hebrew Bible into another language. But then he says, perhaps it's also necessary to violate that ban by translating. And he thinks about translation as a kind of language of decoding and demystification. It's really a very suggestive essay, and gets a little abstract. I have to use this here because at MIT I teach mostly engineers and I cannot do this with them, but in Germany I think I can. So please just indulge me for a moment. Il faudra dire toujours, you have to always demetaphorize the metaphors by which you You have just metaphorized the metaphors themselves. Okay, that's a handful. What is he basically saying? If I were to translate that into American language, I would say, on the one hand, translation reveals the true nature of the original. And I mean, I'm sort of playing with that notion by saying that Carré's translation of the Constitution reveals that, in fact, it was a pro-slavery document. And at the same time, this is Levinas's point here, you have to translate the translation, or to use your guys' terms from SFB 1288, you have to deconstruct the comparison. And I think that the same narrative that shows us that the American constitutional order was pro-slavery, this story of Charles Carré, also shows us that the constitutional order was not inherently one thing or another, right? And it was so only as a result of many different choices, interpretive choices, individual and collective, and the practices that those choices corresponded with, which is to say, as Levinas puts it, you not only have to translate, you have to translate the translation. And in doing so, it's possible, I think, to see the US constitutions as themselves translations of practices, racial and otherwise. In other words, there is no original text to be translated. We're already dealing with a translation as of 1787 and of the dates of these other texts. And because these texts are translations of practices, they have implications for practices elsewhere when translated into other languages and at home when those practices were destabilized under the influence of the Haitian Revolution. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.